Our next speaker is Dr. Elizabeth Dunn from the Geography Department here at CU.
Thanks. I'd like to begin by thanking Mike and Aurora and Ryan and the other students who are making up Occupy CU. You guys are doing a terrific job. And I'd also like to tell you, before I begin, a happy story in contrast to Dr. Aldama's presentation. You know, when we started planning this event, the university asked us to pay for not only the security that every usage of the Glenn Miller Ballroom requires, but to pay for additional security because this was deemed a high-risk event. You know, discussions of tax policies can really get ugly. And one of the things that happened is that a group of people met with the campus police, and they were extremely professional, and they listened to what we had said we were going to do and what we planned. And instead of making us pay for our own policing, in fact, the University of Colorado Police Department is paying themselves to provide security for this event. I work on social movements, and I'm very interested in the strategies for having a successful social movement. And to do that, in my study of that, I spent several years in the early 90s working with the Solidarity Trade Union, which is the Polish trade union that helped bring down communism. So I'd like to talk today about what kinds of strategies for effective organizing that we might gain from a study of the Solidarity movement, and talk a little bit about what I think Occupy can do and might do. Let me begin by telling you all a little bit about what Solidarity is. For those of you, I recognize that many of my students today were nowhere near being born when Solidarity was happening. So Solidarity is a movement which began in the Lenin shipyard in Gdańsk in Poland in August 1980, when a group of workers protested the firing of a crane operator named Anna Valentinowicz, who had been involved in labor activism. 17 days later, Solidarity was already a trade union that encompassed 20 different factories in communist Poland. And by September 1981, that is just a year after its founding, Solidarity had 9.5 million members. That's 80% of the working people in the entire country. And that's an astounding feat. Solidarity became not just a trade union and not just a social movement, but a revolutionary social movement, one that promised to change the fabric of Polish society. Solidarity came to demand not only improved working conditions and better wages, but increased freedom from censorship, freedom from political repression, and a reduction in economic inequality. As an editorial in the underground newspaper, Tygodnik Powszechny put it, they said, "History has taught us that there is no bread without freedom." What we had in mind was not only bread, butter, and sausages, but also justice, democracy, truth, legality, human dignity, freedom of convictions, and the repair of the republic. These seem like goals we could take ourselves. Through strikes and speeches and underground newspapers and other forms of completely nonviolent protest, Solidarity eventually forced the government of Poland to negotiate. And although they went through a year of martial law and the imprisonment of their leaders, by 1989, that is 9 years after their founding, they forced the government to come to the round table talks, pushed through the first free elections in the entire communist bloc, and eventually led to the collapse of the Communist Party state, not only in Poland, but throughout the former Soviet Union. They ended the Cold War. So you can see that Solidarity is a wildly effective social movement that brought down communism, ended the Cold War, and changed history. So what can we learn from them about how to run a successful social movement? I'd like for Occupy to get to 10 million active members in the next year. So let's can learn is to create an interlocking structure. Solidarity grew to 10 million members by linking a diverse set of issues together. Workers' issues like higher wages and better conditions, issues for intellectuals like freedom from censorship, and issues for people of faith like the right to worship without harassment. But they did more than just bring all those issues under a big tent. They created a structure that was interdependent, and this was the key to their success. It really worked first in factories. So, for example, if there was a shipyard, and here is the Gdansk shipyard, if there was a shipyard over here and a button factory over here, the whole notion of solidarity was that whatever the button factory's demands were, the shipyard workers would not go home until the button factory's demands were met. In the past, the government had been able to kind of end strikes by pulling up in a big truck, I'm not joking, pulling up in a big truck and throwing sausages off the back of it because meat was in such shortage and the workers would just take their sausages and go home. But Solidarity's genius, I think, was to say that you couldn't satisfy just one group. You had to satisfy everybody's demands before anybody went home. And what they found is that while the government could pacify one strike, it couldn't pacify 10 or 100 at once. And this linked a huge mass of people together. It was a movement with functional solidarity, not just good wishes, by solidarity, that's what we usually mean, but I mean functional solidarity, and it made the movement much stronger. Now, Occupy up here has also created a big tent. As a leaderless movement that anybody can join, it has not only a central site on Wall Street, but local branches throughout the country. And the commitment of people in the local branches is not to be questioned. I just saw the temperature at Occupy Fairbanks today, 28 degrees below zero. They're out there. This is a real strength of the Occupy movement. Because the movement is leaderless, you can't incarcerate its leaders. Because it has lots of local branches, you can't squash it all at once, even though, as we now know, there were coordinated efforts by something like 15 municipalities to shut down Occupy across the country all at once. Yeah, boo. So you can't squash them all at once. I mean, what Occupy has created, and I think this is genius, is the political equivalent of whack-a-mole. But so far there's been little in the way of creating a structure of interdependence so that we can achieve measurable goals. So one of the questions I think that's worth discussing is how Occupy Boulder can lend strategic strength to Occupy Oakland, or how Occupy Boston can lend support to Occupy LA. How is it that we could lend the protection of we could link the protection of one branch of the movement to the acts of the others? And this is, I think, something that we should debate and think about. The next point I have is that I think it's time to go beyond empty signifiers. Like many social movements, Solidarity itself attracted people to its big tent by using empty signifiers. An empty signifier is an image or a phrase that actually doesn't have a lot of meaning itself, but which allows people to bring their own meaning to the symbol. And this is a really old technique used by product marketers, by Madison Avenue, where we should also be occupying. It's a Madison Avenue technique which lets customers believe whatever they want, regardless of the truth about the product itself. So, for example, Cascadian Farms, which is a subsidiary of General Mills, came up with the slogan, "Taste you can believe in." Does this mean it's tasty? Does it mean it's healthy? Does it mean it's environmentally friendly? Does it mean it's produced by workers who earn a living wage? I mean, who the hell knows what that means, right? It means whatever you want it to mean if you are the consumer. So interestingly, I was teaching about Cascadian Farms in my Geography of Agriculture class one